Last year we looked at the Headphone 2, designed for studio mixing and mastering. They use Hale AMT drivers, which you see in speakers. And I have, as I said in my original review, 3 pairs of speakers here that use those drivers. So I was really keen to check out what they could do in a pair of headphones. And the full range version designed for headphones works well. However, the tuning of the original really wasn't for everyone, as a kind of studio mixing and mastering headphone tends to be flatter sounding than a pair of headphones designed for audiophile use. Many cases in point. So HED came out with the GT version, and the GT version, if I hold it up to the light, looks a little bit different. You can see that the original has some white lettering and a white magnet behind the grille, and whereas the GT version is black and black. But externally, that's not just the difference. Internally, there are some differences as well. But the main thing that's excellent about these is the overall ergonomics. If you want to talk about German over-engineering, these are probably the most over-engineered headphones I've ever seen, probably in a good way in many respects, because they include that adjustment system which uses 2 straps that allow you to pull both the horizontal clamp and the vertical adjustment and set that to your preferences. And once it's set, they pop straight on your head. And the quality of the materials is outstanding, including these ear pads, which have an attachment system which is somewhat unique. They pop off with a firm pull, and they attach via an O-ring around this inner flange, and that holds them on very well. And you just pop them back on as necessary, and you get a spare pair in the box, and you also get a lot of cables. Now, the problem I had with the original Headphone 2 was that the cable was kind of rubbery, and I thought could be easily damaged. Now, the current cable they have on the GT version that this pair came with is similar, a similarly braided cable, but covered in cloth. And it's about 2 meters long and terminates in a 4.4mm plug. But in the box, you get a whole lot of adapters to 4.4-pin XLR, 6.3mm, 3.5mm, and so you can use it as you require with whatever you require, including a long and a short cable. The good thing is, because it on the headphone end terminates in 3.5mm, you can use headphone cables from a whole bunch of different headphones, and it doesn't have a recessed socket, so pretty much any cable should fit, whether you want to get an aftermarket cable or just something simpler or shorter, which I often do, say using a Meze cable with headphones with that termination, simply because they're short and they fit when all my gear is next to me. Onto the design aspects that have changed. Internally is where things are different. While they use the same drivers as far as I'm aware, some changes have been made to the internal damping to give you more bass and more treble. And if you consider the original headphones have a flat monitor tuning, more bass and more treble is generally closer to what maybe a regular audiophile or someone listening to music would like, because, well, it just sounds more entertaining, whereas with a studio monitor you just want to hear the music as it is to determine whether you've got the mix right. Now, I won't go into any more detail about the ergonomics. If you do want to check out all the fine details of that, you can see my original review. I'll throw a card up in the corner. But I just really want to get into the sound for people who want to know how these sound, especially versus the original and versus some of the other headphones I have behind me. Another addition they have is they come with these cloth pads. Now, I'm going to get this out of the way. These cloth pads, well, the sound was incredibly muffled with these on. So once I tried these, it's like, no, put those aside, and didn't bother listening with them anymore. Now, something else to note in that regard is everyone hears slightly differently when they listen to headphones. Some research done by Resolve at headphones.com shows that, say, with a pair of Sennheiser HD800s or HD800Ss as he used, is that people hear bass much the same, but the amount of mid-range and treble they hear varies considerably. So I want to say that the sound with these may suit certain people, but my preferred tuning, if you are one of those people familiar with the Harman curve, the Harman curve to me sounds a little bit too mid-forward and doesn't have quite enough bass for my tastes. It sounds kind of too neutral to me. Now, there are people out there who think that the Harman curve, everything should follow the Harman curve and anything that doesn't is wrong. That is not how the science works. It's an average of preferences, and there is a lot of variation, especially in the bass. So in that, when I give my impressions, note that they are, well, relative to what my hearing is. And something I can say off the bat is, if you prefer a darker tuning to headphones, you find a lot of headphones too bright, you're someone who might describe themselves as treble sensitive, these may suit you more than they suit me. In that regard, for example, I found them to be kind of very warm sounding, somewhat closed in sounding, with not quite enough treble sparkle to bring out the nuances of the music that I like. However, overall in summary, I could say that I can hear there was a lot of detail coming through from the drivers, just not delivered with quite enough brightness for me. Looking at HED's own graphs, it shows that there is an increase generally in the kind of mid-range or upper mid-range and the bass versus the original headphone. However, if you see, and the graph is kind of hard to make out everything because the scale makes it look more exaggerated than it is, there is a considerable drop-off above 6 kilohertz. Some of the tracks I really like Carmen Gomez, and I'll leave a list of the tracks in the description for you to check out, as well as a Qobuz playlist. Carmen Gomez came through with a darker tone, if a good level of nuance and clarity. Now, the applause at the end of the first track I listened to, for example, was snappy and clear, and percussion sounded really natural, if tonally somewhat muted, and that, again, that upper range was a little bit too dark for me. Now, the soundstage felt a bit narrow as a result. I think some of that was due to the tone, but it's also something I noticed with the original version. Now, still, the presentation was very engaging, if I didn't attempt to nitpick the sound, and the sharpness of notes was apparent from the guitars, though they were kind of kept at arm's length, preventing, it becoming fatiguing, especially on tracks where the guitars are like really intense. Now, switching things up a bit to Dead Can Dance, the Spiritchaser album, which you've probably seen me mention on so many reviews and evaluations. Now, the muted treble, I think, was too much for this album. It kind of prevented it sounding as dramatic as it really could, and kind of congesting all the instruments too much. Likewise, I've been listening to a lot of Spoon lately, and their Lucifer on the Sofa album, I think, is excellent. Now, it was a bit overwhelming at more than a moderate volume with this. So this had me wondering if, despite the modifications that HED had done to retune the headphones, if maybe some of the same problems I encountered with the original headphone were happening with these. Now, the original headphone, I noted that inside the cups you had this flat plate, like you do on the front of all AMT drivers, and if you have a flat surface, it reflects, and that causes some degree of congestion and harshness in the mid-range. So what I did on the original, you may have seen, is I got out some of that kind of cheap, kind of paperish, material-backed tape you get at the drugstore, cut out some 3mm strips to match the magnets, and stuck them over the magnets. And I noticed a noticeable improvement in imaging and a drop in harshness with the original headphone too. So I did the same trick, as I had a whole lot of these strips, stuck them inside the headphone 2 GT, and the same thing, improved. The imaging sharpened up, and it's like Spoon stopped becoming congested. It sounded much clearer. Still, you had that smallish sound stage, but there was a bit more delineation in there. It was a bit clearer. Now, I've, of course, way back, talked to Freddie at HED and told him about this, and I don't know how much there's bits of foam in there and how much that is there to help damp those kind of reflections, but I still found that the tape mod worked. Now, of course, this is the point where I have to say, someone's out there is going to go, hey, why don't they do this at the factory? Of course, they're not going to put tape inside their own headphones. They're going to find some kind of coating. Yes, coatings exist for metal, which damp reflections, or some way to shape magnets, like maybe Hi-Fi Man or Odyssey did. Hopefully, they'll find a way, because I think they could improve on this. But also, it's, you always get the argument, they should release them perfect or whatever. As someone who does not engineer headphones and cannot imagine the amount of effort that has gone into design every part of this, which must have been considerable, and the quality that they've come out with, to get carbon fiber moldings, the right tension and shape, the amount of effort they've gone through, the design of this headband adjustment system, and finding just the right material that doesn't stretch, but is still strong and robust and will last a long time. Everything must have taken a lot of effort. So I can't really, in the purest sense, criticize their choices in the end, but I do hope they find a way to improve these, because when I did the tape mod, I felt they were a lot better. So, you could say the other end is this: if you're not someone who's so attached to that kind of argument about what the manufacturer should or shouldn't do, and you find that the tuning is about right for you in a pair of these, try the tape mod. It's a little bit fiddly, but it didn't actually take me too long. And it's, reversible in about 20 seconds, because the ear pads pop off in no time. They pop back on pretty quickly. And the tape, it's just, how steady your fingers are. And especially with all the added damping materials in there, the chance of damaging anything is pretty near zero. So, comparing to something around the same price, Dan Clark Audio's E3s. I do really like these, except maybe that the pure Harman tuning is a little bit too forward for me in the mid-range. I prefer that slight drop off between 1 and 2 kilohertz that you get with Sennheiser, Hi-Fi Man, Focal, and pretty much everyone else. But still, these are pretty excellent headphones. Now, when I switched to the E3s, there's immediate weight and clamp relief, and with more open sound through the mid-range presence. I've always found them to be a little bit intense, and the headphone is more mellow overall with Spoon than the kind of forward mid-range intensity of the E3s. I also have Hi-Fi Man's HE1000 unveiled in for review. They are more my kind of tonality overall, with a kind of brighter, more open, airy sound, but with good mid-bass and low-bass punch, which I really like. And they seem to be very chameleon in how they deliver a lot of stuff really well for me. So that's my kind of preferred tuning over the headphone. So that's my bias there, just in case. But someone who finds Hi-Fi Man too bright, even something like the HE1000 Unveiled, which isn't super bright compared to most Hi-Fi Man headphones, would probably find the headphone better in that regard. But I did want to compare it, especially because they are pretty high-end planers. So instead, I thought about, what if there's a pair of headphones of a similar price that have a similar kind of tuning? Well, there's Meze Poet. Now, I reviewed those just before Can Jam New York, and they have a similar-ish kind of tuning, and they also have a smaller cup size, so they're more closed in as well. And with the tape mod in place still in the GT for comparison, the Poet sounded a little bit lighter and had less of a muffled soundstage, though the tonality again was somewhat closer. So probably in that, the other thing is that the Poet is easier to drive. Now the headphone isn't hard to drive. I mean, I could power them out of something like this W4 and they drove pretty well, although the bass was a little bit weaker, being that the amplification overall, there's just less of it. And I could also run these up, the W4 up to full 100% volume, even with pop music. Still, the headphone performed a bit better on better amplification, whether it be something like a Hugo 2 or even something simply a lot more powerful. Now, switching to a classic track, Tin Pan Alley by Stevie Ray Vaughan, actually a track I listened to long before HeadPhi even existed. I remember actually buying the CD from the CD rental place, I think it was. We used to have CD rental places before they got shut down by the recording industry, because everyone was obviously ripping the CDs onto their computers. Now, this was more upfront and personal with the Poet, and while Stevie Ray Vaughan seemed somewhat further back with the GT, the more muted upper notes sounding a bit imbalanced out of the headphone after listening with the Poet. And so that's the thing, that the lower treble was much more noticeable out of the GT, especially after comparing with other headphones. Just like, for example, I was listening to Bonobo, some of the background percussion that comes through doesn't come through as well through the GT, whereas some of those nuances are a little bit muffled in there with that lack of treble, whereas they come out more clearly in the other headphones I have around here. Some more recent listening is a band called The Smile. If you know who Radiohead is, well, like everyone knows who Radiohead is, go check out The Smile. It does have Radiohead members in there. Their aim is to be something like 90% Radiohead, but without the long process of making Radiohead songs, which is a whole thing in itself if you do end up going down the rabbit hole of reading about that. But they have a track, Don't Get Me Started, on their Cutouts album. And still with the tape mod in the GT, this track comes through with very clean dynamics and both macro and micro detail as much as the track has, a bit of which is obviously helped by the mod with the tape in the GT. The soundstage is not super wide, but is still evenly spread out. And this makes more for an intimate sound than some other headphones. Another one, Cosmo Sheldrake. This is a very interesting guy. I won't bore you with music description and stuff like that, but Linger Longer from, this album is called The Much Much How How and I. This guy's really interesting. It's like modern musical poetry. Yeah, just go check him out. It's just interesting. And anyway, the treble, which is a bit duller for me than most of my regular listening headphones, say the Focal Utopias, for example, which I've been listening with a lot lately, contributes to the slightly narrower sound again, but the clarity of Cosmo Sheldrake's voice isn't dulled, coming through with maybe even slightly excessive sharpness, even with the tape mod in there. Now, I also have an album labeled Noque Studio, N-O-Q-U-E, and you probably saw me mention them in the Can Jam video. They were very high quality recordings of a small classical ensemble with violins and other instruments. And the violin sounded a little bit distant and muffled through the GT, and for my preferences, at least given my level of treble sensitivity, I think someone who is more sensitive to treble, again, would maybe find these ideal, but I didn't find them particularly ideal for classical, just not enough of that violin detail coming through. It was like somewhere distant. And, well, I did find them to have good timbre. They didn't have issues where timbre was messed up by weird, uneven frequency response so much as the sound being too closed in, and especially without the tape mod, things being a little bit hazy, didn't work out particularly well overall. So I think in the end that I hear this potential in the AMT drivers coming through here. If I have really bright pop music, that would probably work for me. It would probably work again for someone with a lot of treble sensitivity who wants a darker headphone. And I've even heard someone, I think it might have been Cameron Golden Sound, who suggested he just liked the originals, but with a bass boost. Now for me, I like chord gear and there's no EQ. If you EQ before using chord gear, it kills the effect of the accurate sound stage. There are things like if you use them with something like I have the iFi's Valkyrie in here, which has a bass boost option in here. I think it was a bass boost from in here. Yeah, extra bass. Or extra presence probably would work, or one of the settings might help with them. Yeah, it's like I love the engineering of these things. It's just so nice. They're just so nicely made. It's like the tuning is not quite there. And I think if they can make a version of the driver which had a more conventional, even if it was closer to Harman tuning, maybe with a couple of differences, that would be a lot better. So I'd like to thank the Japanese distributor for HED for lending me these for longer than I planned, and for HED for sending me across headphones to check out. If you have a pair, do leave a comment. Do you have a pair of the GT and you really love them? Do let us know what setup you do have, and if you like them, or if you've tried them, let me know your own opinions. What music works with them, what gear. It's always great for people like me, if I'm searching online and watching YouTube, to get review of gear, to actually see comments from actual owners of equipment to get more information as well. And I think that makes these videos more valuable to everyone. I'll also leave a link in the description to a place you can buy them. If you use that link, if you don't return them, then I will get a little bit of something back as well. Also, if this review helped you decide that maybe the headphone is not one that you're going to buy, if you happen to be interested in that, buy me a coffee to say thanks. And you can even join our little group where you can chat, ask me questions, join in the fun, and see impressions of gear I'm going to review, give feedback, all that kind of thing. It'd be great to see you there. And the main thing is it helps support making me more videos. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.